Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. How are you?
Doing wonderful. How are you?
Okay. Sorry I missed the other day.
Oh, George, I think that was my fault. I think I sent everybody's link out late, and so you might have just missed it because of me. I tried to
Okay.
get them out the day before, but I just had a lot going on, and I think I missed one of my check marks or off of my checklist, so I apologize for that.
Okay. Yeah, I know I had checked it the day before and the day of, and wasn't anything in. And so when I checked that afternoon, I saw where it came in at about 9:57, I believe. So I said, "Oh my God, I missed it."
Yeah, I apologize for that. I was
Okay.
like, I don't know. It was just life was lifing for me last week,
Oh
so I
yeah,
apologize.
no problem.
But I'm glad you're all here with me today. I did my job good enough and sent y'all the link, so we're back on
Yeah.
track. So today we're going to talk about the value of vulnerability. I will be honest with you all, vulnerability is something that I have struggled with. Um, I like to use myself as an example, not to make it about me, but just because I think it's easier for me to tell you about me than it is to ask about you and put you on the spot. But I grew up in a space where vulnerability was dangerous. Emotional vulnerability was dangerous. And so I just grew up with very rigid boundaries around letting people in, right? And I became very independent very, very early. And so I'm working through a lot of that change, a lot of that healing. And so, of course, I try to find topics that are not only things that I feel will be useful to you in your caregiving journey, but things that I have lived experience with, because I feel like that's the best way for me to relate to the information and things like that. So I hope that you find this information useful. And sometimes I think when we think of vulnerability, we do think of danger, right? We think of fear. We think of something that's going to create chaos or, pain in our lives. And so my challenge for you today is to consider vulnerability as a strength. We are communal creatures. We are wired for community and to be supportive of one another. Nobody can do what we do on our own. And so vulnerability is a way for us to foster connection, for us to live authentically. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that today, and also how that can translate into your caregiving journey, because obviously you're more than likely taking care of somebody who is what we would consider vulnerable as far as their physical capacities, mental capacities, their health. They need you, right? So that puts them in a vulnerable space. But we ourselves as caregivers can also be vulnerable in a way that's going to empower us and the ones that we're taking care of, okay? So when I say the value of vulnerability, it's not weakness, it is a strength through this presentation. And I hope that comes through today by the end of it. This probably won't be a super long information section or portion of our training. And that's okay, because I think that I'm going to start making it a regular habit to pause the recording and have time to have conversations and just to build that community, because I know a lot of you do join my support groups. Some of you guys can't make it. And so I do want to kind of sprinkle in a little bit of support at the end of my trainings. And so you're welcome to stay on. You're welcome to log off, whatever works for you. But just know that afterwards, there will be a space to have conversation after my information. So before we get started, I just want to remind everyone to please put your email in the chat if you haven't done so. This is a way for me to send you a post survey so that I know how you feel about the information, and also get your feedback for future presentations. I have gotten a lot of training ideas through that feedback. So if you have something you want me to talk about, or something I have talked about in the past that you want me to come back and revisit and maybe do a deeper dive on, I'm more than happy to do that. I'm currently working through my July trainings, so this is perfect timing. If you guys have a suggestion, please give it to me so that I can work on that and get you all the information that you need, okay? So let's get into it. First, we're going to try to define vulnerability. Of course, like I said earlier, there's more than one way to think of vulnerability. But vulnerability in this context is when someone will openly share emotions, thoughts, and beliefs with another person, okay? Doing so not only fosters open communication, but also helps us to cultivate that empathy within a relationship, okay? So whether in our family or work environments, we're often in chronic environments of invalidation. I'm sure some of you all can relate to that, especially if you're caring for a loved one and maybe other members of the family aren't stepping up to the plate. You might feel very invalidated in your needs, especially if you reach out to somebody for help and you're ignored. That can be a very hard situation to be in. So we don't know when we're going to be criticized next, or believe we're only as good as our last mistake. That's very common. And we carry that weight of unpredictability. And nobody likes unpredictability, right? Or anxiety. That causes a lot of discomfort. But if we don't allow ourselves to be vulnerable to other people, then that will keep us from being seen by the people that we care about the most. So what if we're to lean into that discomfort, of course, where it's appropriate? We don't want to just say, well, I'm going to be vulnerable and let any old thing happen to me. But we want to lean into that discomfort when it makes sense, and use it as an opportunity to grow. It becomes easy to lean into openness once we know the value of vulnerability. And so hopefully by the end of this, you'll understand where I'm coming from. So here's some of the benefits of vulnerability. So the first part of this is going to be how you being vulnerable opens up a space for your loved one to also be okay, right? To also feel that empathy. So vulnerability builds trust. So one of the most crucial benefits of vulnerability is that it builds trust and intimacy in relationships. When there's no vulnerability and we don't let anyone else see the real us, there's really no knowability, right? It's very difficult for someone to know you if you're always guarded. No one can know you. They're just going to see that exterior version of you. They're just going to see that, that caregiver mask that you put up, right? And in contrast, knowability leads to intimacy and connection with one another. Vulnerability is liberating. So when we embrace vulnerability at opportune times, it becomes liberating. So think about all the weight that comes with the what if questions that we hold on to about whether we want to open up to another person or not. So when we open up, we let that weight go, and it feels freeing, not only to us, but to other people around us. And lastly, vulnerability promotes authenticity, which is one of my favorite words. Research shows that we love for other people to be authentic, right? We can tell when someone's pretending. We can tell when someone's being inauthentic. And we want ourselves and the people around us to feel real. And if we buy into the myth that we always need to be strong and perfect and capable, research says that we're really coming across as inauthentic in that way, because everyone knows that you can't be perfect and capable and strong at all times. So if you're leading with that perfectionist foot, people are going to read that right out of the gate, okay? And if you are leading with that, I don't have any problems, I'm strong, I'm capable, I'm perfect all the time. Think about if you've ever been in a space with someone like that, then you start to second guess yourself, right? Can I be real with this person? Can I show this person my grit? Can I show this person my ugly, right? If they're always projecting or performing perfection, it's going to be very difficult to get to know that person and even feel settled within yourself. And so that's true for us. When we put on that facade, it's very difficult for other people to see us, the real us. And that, of course, is the death to all connection eventually, right? So we want to avoid that. So caregiving, obviously, is a very deeply personal and often challenging role that requires strength, compassion, and resilience. In the context of caregiving, vulnerability and authenticity are two very powerful qualities that can greatly enhance the connection and the support between you and your loved one. So by embracing vulnerability and authenticity, you can create a safe and trusting environment where genuine relationship can flourish. So vulnerability is often seen as a weakness in our culture, right? But it's actually a strength when it comes to caregiving. So when you allow yourself to be vulnerable, you open up the opportunity for those deep connections with your loved one. And by sharing your own struggles, your fears, and your emotions, you create a space for your loved one to feel understood and validated. This fosters trust, empathy, and emotional support, which are obviously very essential for the well-being of you and your loved one. Overall, vulnerability in caregiving is a powerful tool that will allow you to connect on a deeper level with your loved one. And it can foster that trust and empathy and support, creating a nurturing and compassionate caregiving relationship. Okay. Because, of course, if we're putting on this mask of we're perfect, everything's fine, this isn't a big deal, your loved one may be less likely to express their true emotions, their true feelings, and their true needs with you because you're coming across as inauthentic. And so they are almost likely to kind of respond in kind. Okay. So building trust through vulnerability. So trust obviously is a very crucial aspect to caregiving, and vulnerability plays a significant role when fostering that trust. Because if you're taking care of a loved one and they're not trusting you, or they feel like you can't, you're in a safe space for them, that's going to really affect the way that you all interact with one another. So when you allow yourself to be vulnerable, again, that's creating that safe space for your loved one to open up and share their needs. By showing vulnerability, you demonstrate that you're approachable, that you're understanding, and that you're empathetic, okay? So this safe space will allow your loved one to feel comfortable expressing their fears and concerns and emotions, and it also encourages open communication and enables you to better understand the unique needs of that person. So by being vulnerable, you can establish a deeper connection, and that leads to stronger bonds built on trust and mutual understanding. So one way vulnerability can be expressed is through active listening. That's kind of a term that you hear a lot if you're in like a mental health space. And active listening is just really engaging with that person, responding, looking at them when they're talking, nodding your head, smiling, or maybe not smiling depending on what they're talking about. But you're reacting in a way that lets them know that you're listening, right? I'm sure we've all had those situations where we're in conversation with somebody and they're on their phone, or they're, flipping through the channels on the TV, or just kind of giving you that and you're not really listening to what I have to say, right? You're hearing me, but you're not listening, kind of a thing. And so we want to make sure that we do employ those active listening skills when we're talking with our loved one who's being vulnerable and expressing their emotions to us. You can create an environment where your loved one can feel heard and validated by actively engaging in conversations, asking open-ended questions, which is anything that's gonna elicit a response that's not a yes or no. Okay, that's what an open-ended question is. And of course, providing non-judgmental support. So that'll foster a sense of trust and encourages your loved ones to share their thoughts and feelings more freely with you. Now, some of you may not have that problem. Maybe sometimes your loved ones are sharing everything that they feel and think, with no filter. So this isn't something that you're particularly stressed over. But there are some who, especially if you're caring for, a spouse or a parent, someone who maybe has always had that I don't want to say authority, but has been like your equal or your caregiver or something like that, for them to kind of be shifted into a role where they are, the one that needs you more now. That can be very difficult for them. That dynamic has changed. And so by keeping yourself vulnerable and keeping yourself open to hear what they have to say, that can kind of help break that wall down a little bit. And additionally, vulnerability will allow you to show your own imperfections and your own limitations. So by acknowledging that you are not perfect and that you may not have all of the answers, you're creating that atmosphere of authenticity and honesty. And this can be reassuring for your loved one who may feel overwhelmed and uncertain about their own situation, okay? So overall, vulnerability in caregiving is about creating safe and non-judgmental spaces where your loved one can express themselves freely. It is through this vulnerability that trust is built, and that enables you to provide the best possible care for the loved ones that you're taking care of. So how do we create emotional support networks? How does vulnerability help us in that way? So we've learned a little bit about how vulnerability with our loved ones can help them feel comfortable and feel safe to be return that vulnerability back to us. But now we're going to talk about how vulnerability can help you create a support network for yourself. So we know that creating emotional support networks is crucial. That provides a safe space for you to share your experiences, to find advice, and seek advice and find that solace. So vulnerability plays a significant role in fostering these networks. It allows you to open up and connect with others who understand the challenges that you face. Because again, they're not, most people don't know what caregiving is until they're in that situation. Okay, so you can get empathy, you can get support from people who haven't been on this journey, but there's something to be said about somebody who knows where you're coming from, right? So one way we can create emotional support networks is through support groups, right? So that is just a group that's going to bring together other caregivers who are going through similar experiences, providing that safe environment for you to share your stories and offer support. Of course, support groups can be in person. They can also be online, like we have every month. So that's just one way that you can start that building that support network. Another way to foster emotional support networks is by seeking advice from professionals or experienced caregivers. So that can be done through counseling sessions or mentorship programs, where you can gain insight and guidance from those with experience in the field. So, we're thinking maybe more like professional caretakers that come in. Maybe they have some tips on how to build resilience or how to make the day go a little smoother, that kind of thing. So these interactions not only provide practical advice, but they can also create a sense of community and understanding. So of course, by embracing vulnerability and actively seeking emotional support networks, you can find comfort, validation, and encouragement through this journey. These networks can become a lifeline for you, offering a space where you can share your joys, your frustrations, and your fears without judgment. Okay, again, if you're talking with somebody who's been there before, they're a little less likely to judge you. Probably a lot less harshly than you're judging yourself, right? Because it's like, I know I've been in spaces where, I'm finally vulnerable. I let my guard down. I tell somebody how I'm feeling. And then somebody goes, oh, me too. And it's like, whew, it's not just me. I'm not weird. I'm not crazy. Well, I might be weird and crazy, but in this situation, I'm not being weird and crazy. Okay. And so that can make it a lot easier for you to be vulnerable when you have somebody who's been on that same journey and understands where you're coming from. And so, of course, through these connections, you can find strength and resilience to continue providing that compassionate care. So embracing vulnerability as a strength. So vulnerability will allow you to develop resilience in the face of adversity. It takes courage to confront the emotional toll of caregiving and acknowledge the limitations and challenges that come with it. Again, we're having that, put on that face of, I've got this, I don't need any help, right? But inside you're withering, okay? By embracing vulnerability, you can cultivate a strength that enables you to adapt to changing circumstances, overcome obstacles, and continue providing that care with unwavering dedication. Embracing vulnerability empowers you to be more effective in your role. It can create an environment of trust and authenticity, again, where your loved one feels safe to express themselves, their needs, their fears, their desires. And this open communication and genuine connection will enable you to tailor the care of your loved one to their needs, ensuring that that support is provided, and that it's impactful and meaningful. Okay. And again, you can maybe even think about how you being vulnerable allows your loved one to be vulnerable. And then you can have those conversations about, how they're feeling. Are they feeling depressed? Are they feeling sad? Are they fearful? And that can foster that relationship where maybe to them, it seems less like the work you're doing is just a task, that you're doing it because of the relationship you have. Okay. Of course, a lot of your loved ones probably know that, but sometimes it's good to have that little reminder. So in challenging societal notions that vulnerability is a weakness, you can redefine that narrative. So you can embrace vulnerability as a strength and enable you to be more compassionate, resilient, and effective in your role. By recognizing and valuing vulnerability, you're transforming the way that the care is delivered to your loved one, fostering deep connections and providing a higher level of support. Okay. So you're not just running through the motions, you're having like the caregiving that you're doing is part of the relationship. You're doing it to foster relationship, to build relationship, to have that connection. So seeking support as a caregiver, it's very crucial as you navigate the challenges of caregiving with authenticity and vulnerability that you have support. Caregiving, as you know, can be emotionally and physically demanding, and it's essential for you to have a support system in place to help you cope and maintain your well-being. Sharing stories, exchanging advice, and finding solace in the company of others who understand that unique challenge of caregiving can be incredibly beneficial. So of course, you could do professional counseling if you want to. We have that Caregiver Wellness Initiative available to all caregivers in our program, to where you can have that mental health support to kind of help you over a mental health crisis or a hard time in your life, maybe where you're struggling and your tried and true coping mechanisms are not doing what they used to do anymore. And so you need a little bit more assistance. So of course, if you're interested in the Caregiver Wellness Initiative, please let me know and I'll get that information to you. Counseling sessions can also be a space for you to explore your own needs and your own emotions, right? And allow you to better understand yourself and your caregiving journey. We often will hear people ask us, how is our loved one doing? How often do you hear, how are you doing, right? So an emotional support network, seeking those supports with other caregivers, they're gonna ask you, how are you doing, right? So it's important for you to realize that seeking support is not a sign of weakness, but rather that is the strength, right? When you're feeling like you can't do it anymore, it takes a lot of strength to ask somebody for help, okay? So by reaching out for help, you are prioritizing your own well-being and ensuring that you can continue to provide that authentic and vulnerable care for your loved one. And I've said it a million times and I'll say it again, caring for yourself is caring for your loved one. And that's not just your physical needs, that's also your emotional and your mental and all the facets of well-being at the same time, okay? You guys deserve support and understanding as you navigate the challenges of this job. And seeking support from others is a very powerful way to find strength and resilience needed for that role. So when can you be vulnerable, right? For those of you who want to start being vulnerable, it can be tempting to just go all in and just put all your business out on Front Street to whoever's going to listen to you. But that can actually shock the system and kind of negate the benefits of vulnerability. So rather than laying everything out on the line right away, it's important to take small steps. So being vulnerable doesn't mean you're spilling your entire life story to everyone that you meet. It just means that you're going to start small and choose the right time to open up. And I would argue to say the right person to open up to. Pay attention to how you feel when you're vulnerable in your relationships. Start slow and make sure that you're feeling comfortable and that your vulnerability is reciprocated within that relationship. And I think that's very key. If you are just spilling your guts to somebody and they're not reciprocating that vulnerability, they've still got their mask on and they're still being very rigid, you're probably not going to get the kind of support and compassion and empathy that you're looking for from that person. And that doesn't mean that that person's wrong for behaving that way. Like I said, I come from a place of very rigid boundaries. It might just be something they're not comfortable with because they're not used to it. And that's okay. Maybe you just need to find another person who can be more reciprocal in that vulnerability, okay? Because again, you're looking for a relationship, okay? And that's going to be reciprocated. It's going to be a back and forth. So I love this quote by Brene Brown. And if you don't know who Brene Brown is, she is, I would say, America's social worker. She's gotten a lot of publicity over the years. She researches shame and vulnerability in the human animal. And her work is fascinating. And one thing this is a quote from her, it says, vulnerability is the core, the heart, the center of meaningful human experiences. And I think if you just think about that, you could probably see how that is true. If you have relationships with people where they are really meaningful and you've had those really meaningful and powerful experiences, vulnerability had to be part of that mix, right? It's very hard to have deep, meaningful human connections when everyone's playing a role, everyone's got a mask on, everyone's got very rigid boundaries. It's like you're just kind of, playing Barbies, like it's very static. But when you open up and you're vulnerable and you let someone see your grit, you let somebody see your hurt and your pain and your ugly, that is where real meaningful experiences, real meaningful connection happens. So even though it can be very uncomfortable to be vulnerable, um, vulnerability is also the birthplace for joy, for creativity and authenticity and love. So with vulnerability, we can let our guards down and we can be seen for who we truly are. And I think that at the core of our human experience, what we all really long for is that feeling of belonging, right? That feeling of acceptance. Another Brene Brown quote that I like, they said the opposite of belonging is fitting in, because when you're fitting in, you're playing a role, you're trying to be like the people that you're trying to be in relationship with, right? But belonging means regardless, that's your home, right? That's where you're supposed to be. Okay. Let's see here. So the truth about vulnerability is that it's not a weakness, it is a strength, because it's easy for us to build barriers, right? It's easy for us to pretend, to put up that facade. It's exponentially more difficult to let it down, to let your wall down and to let somebody in. Because again, it's called vulnerability for a reason, because you're allowing somebody that into that sacred space of your heart, right? And that can be very tragic if somebody is not worthy of that privilege, right? So again, make sure the people you're being vulnerable with are worthy of that sacred space, right? To be in that space with you. Vulnerability allows us to be our authentic selves instead of trying to please others. Now, I don't know how many of you all are passionate about your own authenticity, but over the years, I have very desperately become that person, mostly because I'm raising children. And I know that in order for them to lead authentic lives and to be comfortable in their own skins, I have to model that behavior for them. And so I've been on a huge authenticity trek for the last 4 or 5 years. And it's been incredibly difficult because, like I said before, I've come from a place of very rigid boundaries, building those walls up, not letting people in. And so it's definitely been a project for me to work on myself so that I can live by example for my children. So with vulnerability, we build empathy, we let down our walls, understanding and sharing our feelings easier, and encouraging others to do the same. And so in turn, we become more understanding and more willing to forgive others and more willing to give love to others. Being vulnerable can help us to work through our emotions easier rather than pushing them away, right? Because you're like, well, this is part of me. I don't have to deny it or reject it. I can embrace it and find out what's going on. And, excuse me, vulnerability fosters good emotional and mental health, okay? Vulnerability is also a sign of courage. We become more resilient and brave when we embrace who we truly are and what we're really feeling. How many times have you said, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine, and then you're not? And then you can't pretend anymore, and then you just kind of break down, okay? Being vulnerable and being authentic means that you accept and embrace that within you, and you don't push it away, because you know you can push it down all you want to, it's not going anywhere. So you might as well embrace it and work through it and integrate it as best you can. Vulnerability is an inevitable part of life. Instead of trying to fight it, embrace it and know that it will make your life more fulfilling in the long run. So think about it. Saying I love you to someone is very vulnerable. Trying something new is vulnerable and nerve-wracking, but it's vulnerability. Sharing a difficult experience or struggle you've had with someone is also vulnerable and scary. So while we initially may want to avoid all of that kind of stuff, they can actually be extremely rewarding to go through. Ultimately, welcoming vulnerability will allow us to have a genuinely fulfilling life, okay? Because you know who you are, the people around you know who you are, and you don't have to pretend anymore, and that's freeing. So I'm gonna end here with this, this story, and this is from a woman named Suzanne White, and she is fondly refers to herself as the caregiver warrior. Okay, so I'm just going to read this story to you and think about it and see if this resonates with you. So Suzanne says, I remember the first time I stumbled on being vulnerable with my mom after she was diagnosed with dementia and I became her caregiver. One day I was worn out, exhausted, and scared, and I must have been radiating child in distress signals because she asked me what was wrong. I was too tired to put on a happy face and say I was fine so that she wouldn't worry. So I said that I was just tired and worn out and not having the best day. To my surprise, she came back almost immediately with clarity she hadn't shown for some time and said, "Well, that's because you're running around taking care of me and your dad, and you need to take a break." She said it with love and concern. I was completely surprised and quite honestly so moved I felt myself start to cry. I tried to blink back the tears. I gave her a big hug and I said, "Thank you, Mommy, and I love you." And I told her I just wanted her to be safe and promised I would take better care of myself. She patted me and then returned to her favorite movie that she was watching on TV. One of the biggest fears had always been letting my mask slip and having my parents and everyone around me see that instead of a committed, capable, and protective caregiver, they would see the trembling, scared, unprepared, inexperienced, and sometimes 6-year-old behind the mask. If everyone knew how I really looked and felt, they would panic, mock, criticize, and worse, feel unsafe and unprotected. Having let the mask slide down a little and be heard, loved, and supported by my mom, who was in the throes of dementia, gave me pause and taught me a dramatic lesson. It would be one of many lessons I learned about how vulnerability works. When I allowed myself to be seen by those I trusted and loved and opened up about what I was feeling and experiencing, even when it was not pretty or made me feel like an imposter or a failure or even crazy, I was always, and I mean always, shocked at the positive, loving reaction that I got. When I was an open, authentic, and vulnerable caregiver, people were not only kind and understanding, they would offer to help me when I needed it the most. When I was honest about my fears, struggles, and exhaustion, I found out that other caregivers, families, and friends had gone through or were going through similar situations. They had insight and could offer me solutions and validation. I realized I was not alone and there was nothing wrong with me. And I love that story because it seemed like in just that very simple moment where she just said, "I'm tired and I'm not having a good day," that transformed her world, right? Her mother heard her, accepted that, and gave her encouragement, something she wasn't expecting. So how many times in your life, whether it's related to caregiving or not, where someone asked you how you are and you struggled with telling them the truth, right? It's easier to say I'm fine and move on. "Oh, I'm fine. How are you?" Right? But hopefully this story kind of gave you that idea that maybe you can be vulnerable when someone asks you how you're doing. Be honest with them, right? And see how that changes. See how you feel when you express that vulnerability. And it's often, I think we don't give our loved ones enough credit. Sometimes we think that they're not going to understand what you're going through, or they're not going to hear you, or they're going to judge you. You never know until you try, right? So I hope that inspires you to be a little bit more vulnerable when the opportunity arises. So that's all the info I have for you today. I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and I'll pause the recording.